Please be advised that this serving of AIDS, the Lost Voices, may cause offense or upset as
we read newspaper articles from the 1980s and 90s that may include language and phrases that may be viewed outdated. Some articles and discussions may include brief references and descriptions to self-harm, death, post-mortem, and the odd uncontrollable expletive not suitable for children or adults that act like children. Roll it!
AIDS brings a response
Fight
from the
against
government.
AIDS, the disease which claims life.
Welcome to Extra Tea with your camp host, William Hampson.
And my fabulous co-host, Gloria!
And between us, we'll be looking back through the decades at how Britain reported on the AIDS pandemic.
And where we will try to unpick individual stories in the newspaper archives from the 80s, 90s and noughties.
Ready?
Ready.
All right, let's do it. Hey girl, how are you?
Yeah, all good.
I have to say, what the listeners can't see is that you always put on this amazing afternoon tea for our
Gloria,
recording.
it's clearly tea fit for a queen. So we've got some sandwiches, got smoked salmon and cream cheese, some cucumber, and some coronation chicken, and then we've got some scones with some clotted cream, and then we just got a selection of cakes on top. You know, it's just
Ooh, I don't know which treat to pick.
Ooh, she's going for the mini eclair.
Ooh, yes, this one's for me.
Ooh, good choice. Tart. A jam tart.
I'm not even going to respond to that. Shall we just get started?
Okay, I'm ready.
So, in the last serving, we talked about the petition you headed in 2023 on HIV stigma. And from that, you shared how the press, in particular the gay press, chose to ignore your calls for them to get behind and support the petition with the wider community.
You just caught me on the hop there. I was trying to have a quick slurp of my tea. You're such a shady bitch trying to catch me out. But, no, exactly. I mean, I don't want to keep going on about it, but I think the media and the gay media would very much like us to remain silent. People living with HIV, you know, in the wider community and the general public, and gay and trans people that are living with HIV. But, you know, we will be silenced no more. We will continue to campaign for an end to HIV stigma and the government to update the public as a means to bring about that end. And let's just put it this way, our voices will be lost no more, let's put it
So
like that.
we thought it would be interesting to delve into the newspaper archives and take a look at how the British press reported on HIV and the AIDS pandemic. And I know you touched on this in your blog.
Yeah, the blog post only came about, I suppose, after a little bit of macabre curiosity by myself, obviously living with a condition. I was born in 1982, so I remember visually seeing things on front of newspapers in regards to AIDS, obviously having zero understanding of what it actually meant or what the story was about. And I went into the newspaper archives and I just thought, oh God, this is just wrong. And obviously as I'm reading the stories, some of them were just so moving and heartbreaking, and a lot of them have just stuck with me since reading them. And I just think these can't lay in the archives like unheard. These voices, these people, these stories should be told. People should be aware or reminded of what actually went on. And I think a lot of HIV and AIDS stigma that still exists today comes from the British press, the way that they reported on it, because it was absolutely vile. You know, why is it that they need to be lost forever in the archive?
Okay, first up is a small piece from the Evening Sentinel newspaper. What part of the UK does this cover?
The Evening Sentinel covers Staffordshire, but I think it's a local paper from Stoke-on-Trent.
It is dated the 8th of January, 1986, and the headline reads, AIDS name dropped.
A Stoke-on-Trent shop has changed its name to avoid confusion over the title of an incurable killer disease.
I'm just reading a little further down. This can't be true.
It's coming. Donald Walden and Sons have dropped the description Hanley AIDS Centre from the business because of a clash with the virus AIDS. And the shop specialising in equipment for disabled people has removed all references to the word aid from advertising notepaper and catalogues.
Well, I can see his point. It is an unfortunate coincidence. But to go to those links, really?
Yeah, and when was this again? 1986. I see already there's quite a lot of hysteria that's been whipped up by the British press, you know, essentially creating HIV and AIDS stigma for someone to have to go to such lengths to change the name of their business.
I see he goes on to say, it created a few problems when we realized our name had the same term as the disease.
You know, it must have been quite stressful and tiring when you're trying to run a business to be the butt of the jokes with locals. And I can see the article concludes, we use the word equipment instead of AIDS now, said Mr. Donald Wardle, owner of the shop in the Hanley bus station.
That was an article from 1986. Do you know when HIV or AIDS first appeared in the British press?
Well, from my blog post from when I delved into the British newspaper archives around the subject of HIV and AIDS, the earliest I could find reference to AIDS termed as, I quote, the gay disease, was on the 14th of November 1982 in The Observer, page 25, in an article titled No Defence Against Gay Disease. This was written by Christian Doyle, Health from America. And the article goes on to state that there's been 600 victims in America, 250 have already lost their lives in the last 18 months. And it wasn't long after that the British press also started to refer to it as the gay plague.
You mentioned the term gay plague, which the media often use to refer to HIV and AIDS. And this leads us on to the next story, which the Mirror newspaper published as a front page exclusive on the 12th of December, 1985.
Yeah, and this story actually caught me out because when you're looking for the newspaper archives, it generally highlights the article that it wants you to look at. And in this case, even though it was on the front page of the Mirror, the software didn't highlight the massive fuck off headline. So when I initially read the strapline and then the article, and the strapline was, which I thought was the headline, Hospital Panic Over Trail of Blood. And I thought, say this is an AIDS-related blood story. This is in a hospital setting. This is quite soft and, quite decent language. And I thought, actually, that's quite unusual for the Mirror, even in 1985. It wasn't until I'd read the article and found how cutting it was that I then saw the big fuck-off article under the Mirror's big red infamous logo, AIDS victim runs amok. And I thought, okay, we're back in the room. I missed this, but okay, here the Mirror have somewhat redeemed themselves. I'm an idiot. I was looking at the wrong thing. So yeah, we've got the big headline, AIDS victim runs amok. And then you've got exclusive in like a little star, because you'll find as we read more and more articles over this story, every story that's related to HIV or AIDS is an exclusive. And then you've got hospital panic over trail of blood as the strapline.
If the AIDS victim wasn't negatively charged by 1985, then put that with runs amok. Surely that's going to panic anybody to want to buy a copy.
Yeah, and this is what tabloids then and today, do really well at in selling and shifting newspapers by creating stories that essentially feed into mass hysteria and panic. And there would have been no more mass hysteria and panic than there was in the 80s with the AIDS pandemic. And then also as well, you've got a great opportunity to vilify a whole group of homosexual gays by dubbing it the gay plague. So, it's a win-win for them in shifting newspapers.
And how much was the Mirror in 1985?
It's 18 pence of your hard-earned cash.
Read on, and I'll let you know if it's worth parting with my 18 pence.
So the strapline reads, exclusive, hospital panic over trail of blood. An AIDS patient slashed his wrists and ran amok in a hospital. Staff panicked as he splashed blood everywhere. They were too scared to touch him in case they caught the dreaded gay plague.
No way. It actually says dreaded gay plague.
Mm-hmm.
I take it this only made the front page of a national newspaper simply because he was HIV positive. Because how many other people cut their wrists in 1985?
Oh, absolutely.
And had it splashed all over the front page of a national newspaper nonetheless.
Absolutely, because, someone slashing their wrists in distress or despair in a hospital wouldn't have made the front page of a newspaper if it made a newspaper, a national newspaper anyway, at all. So, the only story here that they're pushing is the AIDS element, and they've outed this gentleman as being gay. I don't know if they kind of confirm this later on in the article, and I can't understand what relevance that would have, but referring to it as a dreaded gay plague and somebody that's got it, to me is them implying that this is a homosexual, so what's that telling the reader? And it goes on to say, police were called, but it was considered inappropriate to arrest him. Doctors and staff eventually managed to calm the man who has a history of mental illness.
Arrest him for what? Being in the hospital and cutting his wrists as they claim running amok? Which really sounds like a man who is distressed in some way.
Exactly. So, so if he is acting in a very distressed manner, you would think that he would be in the right place to be brought back into some kind of normality or reality by medical professionals and not the police. Also, as well, he's got these open wounds that are on the wrists. I think we know, without having to go into too much detail, that that's very dangerous. It's life-ending. So you, again, would think that he's in the best place to receive care. This is a central London hospital. But anyway, the article does go on to state he was then taken back to the psychiatric ward where he was being treated at London's Charing Cross Hospital.
So this poor man was a patient on the hospital psychiatric ward, and he wasn't essentially in hospital for being HIV positive?
Yeah, it seems so.
I cannot get my head around why they called the police. It seems their unwillingness to touch him most likely indicates they were afraid to even get close to him to calm him down.
It's weird because, it doesn't give any indication that they were dealing with him for a long time and they were perhaps calling police as a little bit of a visual backup to try and calm the man down. But then I can't help but think that they were hoping that the police would just merely cart him off, bang him into a cell, and that was it. They could just, kind of just wash their hands of him. They wouldn't have to deal with him. They wouldn't have the fear of being infected by the dreaded gay plague, as the article states at the top. But the police are quoted as saying that it was deemed, quote, inappropriate to arrest him, and I can't see from the article what grounds they would have to arrest him, and essentially it is inappropriate because he's in the right place to receive the right care and attention. Putting him in a police cell wasn't the place for him to be. But I just can't help thinking that maybe the police were also unwilling was declaring it was inappropriate to arrest him because they too didn't want to touch him in fear of catching AIDS. Having to deal with him back at the police station, maybe him kicking off in the same way he was in the hospital. Maybe I'm just absolutely completely wrong, but, I just can't help but think that's probably a possibility as well.
Yeah, that's a possibility.
And the article goes on to say, nurses and other staff wearing protective clothing cleaned up the trail of potentially infectious blood. Hospital boss Richard Brown admitted that the incident caused some confusion. New rules have now been drawn up to deal with any similar alert. Staff will dress in biohazard gowns, masks and gloves and restrain any AIDS patient seen as a threat to himself or others.
But surely, they would restrain any patient on a psychiatric ward that was a threat to themselves or others, not just the patients who were HIV positive.
Oh, absolutely. Anybody who's going to be a threat to themselves or others should be restrained in whatever restraint means. But I think obviously the purpose of the article here is to kind of feed into the narrative that, the stigma and the vilification of AIDS patients, that they'll be treated like animals, they'll be treated like dogs, they'll be restrained. I think when you're reading the story as it pans out, you're kind of getting an image of, kind of Hannibal Lecter type person and that kind of level of restraint. But, you're completely right. Anybody who's on a psychiatric ward that's going to be a threat to themselves or others should be restrained in one way or another. Not just because they're AIDS patients, as the article outlines.
As for gowns and masks, did they not do this before AIDS when dealing with blood and bodily fluids?
No, they did. That's the thing. And we're going to touch on this more in the next episode, but there was a couple of articles where a lot of professional bodies came together in 1983, so 2 years prior to this article. They came together to discuss how to deal with AIDS patients in regards to blood and bodily fluids. And they were saying that there's no change, really, in the sense of before AIDS came along, they were using what we would term today as PPE, goggles, masks, gowns, gloves, when dealing with patients with other blood-borne diseases, such as hepatitis was one example that they gave, or other infectious diseases. So it's quite extraordinary that as early as 1983, there was an understanding that AIDS was a blood-borne virus, why there wasn't already this precaution that they seemingly had in medical settings in the UK when dealing with hepatitis to apply to dealing with patients with AIDS, as I say, when they knew it was already a blood-borne virus. And while this is just the newspaper quoting the hospital, again, it just feeds into the hospital trying to reassure the public that they're taking all precautions necessary, and also as well, it's like a double whammy. It's a way for the newspaper to again just vilify, dehumanize the AIDS patient that they're talking about by mentioning how they're going to be dealt with, gowns and gloves and masks and goggles. It kind of gives you the image, and I imagine it probably give you the image at the time, the classic image we see of the Black Death. The guy in the black gown and then the big black face mask and the goggles on. It's kind of stirring up that kind of rhetoric, I feel, anyway. So the article does go on to say, Mr. Brown, who was the hospital boss, Mr. Brown said that AIDS tests on the man's blood proved positive. That does not mean he had the disease or that he was certain to get it, he said. Some people are carriers without suffering from it, but it was a hazard.
I'm confused. So did the patient have HIV/AIDS or not?
Well, it does sound like that the hospital boss, Mr. Brown, is perhaps playing down this event, either for damage limitation for the hospital's reputation or maybe even his own reputation, or perhaps just to relay any fears that current patients had, or any prospective patients that were going to be coming up for surgeries at the hospital, say. But I think as well he's almost on the right track in the sense of what he's trying to explain is what many other medical professionals were explaining in many other articles that I read around 1985. It hasn't developed into AIDS, and we now know today, obviously with the benefit of hindsight and amazing science, that on average they say it takes about 8 to 10 years for HIV left untreated to develop into AIDS, which then results in a death or an AIDS-related death through other complications. So I think that's what he's probably trying to convey, is that, yeah, he's positive, which would be HIV positive, but it's not developed into AIDS yet. And then Mr. Brown goes on to conclude the article by saying, the man's wrists were only superficially cut, but a little blood goes a long way. The patient is now in a mental hospital.
What a sad story.
Yeah, very sad story.
Were you able to find anything else out about him?
Sadly not, because the only one kind of dignifying, act that this paper and the hospital did was he remains anonymous. They didn't actually state his name. But I guess it would have been nice to be able to look him up and find out how life panned out for him. But I think, like I just said, I think ultimately we know how it ended.
I mean, how does this kind of story that's not even really a story fall into a journalist's hands anyway?
I don't know, because I understand that journalists at the time, they listened into police radios, to try and, intercept the scoop so they could shoot off to wherever the action was to try and get the first photograph or to get the story as an exclusive. But I don't know, did somebody perhaps leak the story from the hospital? Was it perhaps maybe another patient saw something, or somebody who was visiting a patient saw this all kicking off and called the newspaper, learning that this person obviously had HIV/AIDS? Was it not an isolated ward? Was there other HIV/AIDS patients there? I don't know. It's really hard to tell. I think we both agree that this wasn't really kind of a newsworthy story. Definitely not a story that warranted going on the front page of a national tabloid newspaper.
There is that, but what's the motive?
I'd have to agree with what you were saying at the outset. Really, if you strip this back, what is the story?
There must have been many who slashed their wrists and acted in a distressed manner or run amok, as the paper claimed. But it doesn't make it into the front page of a newspaper.
I don't think there's a story there at all, really, not even one that's in the public interest. And I don't mean to diminish the man's memory whatsoever, but, if anything, if it had to be reported on because there was an element of public interest, then this should have been perhaps at the back of the newspaper in a section that nobody really kind of ever bothers with, and it's just a couple of lines long. Yesterday, police were called to Central London Hospital to deal with patient who'd slashed their wrists. Patient was calmed down and returned to the ward.
Unless you chuck in AIDS to sensationalize the story, the disease, the individual, all of it.
If there is like a public interest element to referring to HIV/AIDS, then they could have just said patient was known to be HIV positive or patient was known to have AIDS. That story alone would have just made people actually reading it go, oh my God, this is getting out of hand. We've got AIDS in the UK. You've got people that are so desperate that they're slashing their wrists because they want to end their lives. It would have just been a little bit more of a sympathetic approach rather than this deliberate vilification by outing this man as gay when there's no reference to that in the, kind of the quotes in the article whatsoever. But they've alluded to the fact that this man is gay because they've referred to he's got the dreaded gay plague. So to have the dreaded gay plague implies that you must be gay. Everybody's a bit worried to touch him. The AIDS patients in the future will be restrained. So you kind of get the image that, people with HIV/AIDS in the future are all going to be locked up in chains because you can't go near them. They're that dangerous. And what really makes my heart sink with this story is the fact that when the article concludes that the wounds to his wrists were only superficial, I can't help but think, because it's well documented and we've seen it depicted on television, that there was so much fear and stigma of HIV/AIDS patients in hospital that they were literally secluded in isolation in rooms or in empty, dusty, unused wards, literally bolted and locked in, and they weren't allowed to leave. And I just can't help but think that having superficial wounds to his wrists, if he was intent on ending his life, probably just screams the fact that this was an individual that just wanted some care and attention. And I just think it's really quite sad as well, because I think we know how this ends. 1985, there was no treatment for HIV/AIDS. There was definitely no cure, and there still isn't, but there was no treatment. So the really sad thing is that we know how this story ends, and I just hope that he got the care and attention that he deserved.
What's the next story?
Well...
I don't know if I can handle another because it makes me so angry.
This one has a more positive spin on it, and it might lighten the mood, because on the 19th of June 1987, the Daily Mirror ran a story with the headline, AIDS Boost. It says, AIDS fears have helped to boost a firm that makes condoms. London International Group, which also manufactures surgical gloves, announced yesterday that its profits rose too.
How is that positive?
Granted, the article on the face of it might appear to be a bit grotesque. However, by the time of the article in June 1987, the AIDS Don't Die of Ignorance campaign was in full swing, mainly with the TV advert of the falling AIDS tombstone. Now remember, this is the campaign that I was getting the petition for the government to update the public on, because it seems the British public were taking note and ensuring they were protecting themselves, given the article concludes, the increase coincided with the government's health warning campaign about the deadly virus. However, things do take a sinister turn with the two-page spread that appears in the People newspaper the following month, because on the 26th of July 1987, there is a picture of a skeleton dressed as the Grim Reaper with the headline across both pages, "They're making a killing out of AIDS."
No way!
Yes, way. But anyway, the article mentions the previous article under the strapline, "Rubber profits on the bounce," quite snazzy, no? And state, London International, which changed its name from London Rubber in an attempt to present a glossier image, now glories in being the world's largest manufacturer of the sheath. I mean, who the fuck calls it a sheath? But anyway, the whole point of this two-page spread is that the newspaper is meant to be highlighting companies that are somehow cashing in on the AIDS pandemic, which is quite ironic, really, because essentially that's what the newspaper is doing itself with this very story, and continues to do for a couple of decades by stigmatising people living with HIV and AIDS, and also vilifying an entire community of gay men. But anyway, I must admit, in parts, this article, the language does make me squirm and makes me feel slightly uncomfortable, and I think you'll probably see why. But anyway, let's get on to it. So, multinational drug companies down to humble high street t-shirt sellers are all making a killing out of AIDS. The century's worst medical scare is yielding fortunes for operators with an eye for the main chance. Private clinics are cashing in on simple blood tests for those worried about having the disease, which has so far sentenced 500 people in Britain to a slow, agonising death. Insurance companies have jacked up their premiums to those in high-risk groups. Blood banks are reaping the rewards for safe storage of worried donors' infection-free plasma. Condom manufacturers who put their products in mothballs with the advent of the pill have seen sales explode, with outlets mushrooming in supermarkets. Stores and boutiques are flogging t-shirts with trendy logos and slogans about AIDS, the Grim Reaper, all designed to make the cash tills ring. And for safe, sex-conscious yuppies, there's even a leather wallet containing condoms that fit neatly into a file of facts at £20 a time. And across the entire 2 pages, the article goes on and on and on with other claims of how companies are cashing in on the AIDS pandemic. And there's a couple of photographs of a couple of people that had since passed from AIDS, well-known people. And there's also a picture inset of a young girl wearing a t-shirt with dot cotton with a fag in her hand that says "dot says wear a condom." So I suppose it takes all sorts, really. But anyway, but within the 2-page spread, there is an article with the headline "The Dirty Trick Solution," where a man from Gloucester was selling a cure for AIDS. And the article reads, "A man marketing a miracle AIDS cure has admitted his potions are nothing more than slightly dirty water. Former car salesman David Lovell flogs 30 millilitre bottles of the grandly named Garudus Gemelixus for a minimum of $5.95 each. Literature claims pure water is poured over gems, crystals and precious metals before being bottled."
Seriously? Gems and crystals?
Yep.
I cannot even take the piss out of this because I cannot for a single moment begin to imagine what hope you'd cling to when facing the diagnosis of AIDS back then.
This is it. It's 1987. There's no effective treatment. I mean, there's no cure. There's still no cure today, but at least there's effective treatment. And you can't imagine, what hope you would cling to. And you've got opportunists such as this fucking scumbag, David Lovell, who's offering up this elixir. The article does continue. Then, hey presto, the solution picks up ancient healing powers. Besides banishing AIDS, the potion is supposed to cure more than 100 ailments, but analysis showed the solution to be demineralised water, ideal for steam irons. Harley Street physician and AIDS specialist Dr. John Seal said, "It's inconceivable this stuff should work. It's gobbledygook." Lovell, 45, based at Yorkley, Forest of Dean, Gloucestershire, denies getting rich by exploiting the desperately ill. "You don't do this sort of thing if you want to make money," he added, with typical salesman's charm.
Ugh, what a scumbag.
I know, right?
Did they take any action against him?
I did find an article in his local rag, the Western Daily, on the 29th of August 1987, where trading standards were now investigating as a result of the People's publication of the elixir being nothing more than demineralised water. With the headline, "Remedy in a Bottle for AIDS is Probed," the article reads, "Trading standards officers were last night investigating a West couple who are marketing a bottled AIDS remedy. David and Phyllis Lovell of Yorkley in the Forest of Dean claim the elixir can help AIDS sufferers. Their company, Crystal World, sell the liquid..."
I can't resist. There is nothing crystal clear about this story, and Phyllis and Dillis's motives, or whatever he's called.
Dillis. His name's David, but I know, right? Anyway, the article continues, but a Gloucester Trading Standards officer said the couple's claims were now being investigated. "We have been trying to get our hands on a bottle, but they have been out of the premises when we call. It all depends on whether you believe in alternative medicine, but this does seem far-fetched to us," said the Trading Standards officer. Mr. Lovell, aged 45, a former frozen food technician, runs his business from a house in George Road, Yorkley. Last night he refused to comment on the elixir, saying, "I would rather not. I want to hear what Trading Standards have to say about it first." And I did try to follow up to see if there was anything else, but there wasn't. So I guess, we didn't need the press to tell us what the people had already told us, that this was just demineralised water. And one would kind of hope that Phyllis and Dillis had perhaps given up the elixir and ceased sales immediately, perhaps on the advice of Trading Standards. What would happen if they didn't? But had they continued, I would imagine they would have felt the full force of the law.
Speaking of the law, I understand you have an incredibly sad story involving the police in 1987.
Yeah, so this was a story that was published in 2 national newspapers on the 7th of January 1987. The first being page 5 of the Daily Mirror, where the headline reads, "Kiss of Life Cop Fears AIDS." A young policeman was under observation last night after giving the kiss of life to a dying man who had AIDS.
I know I'm most likely stating the obvious. The article states, quote, "to a dying man who had AIDS," past tense. So a man has died, but the headline has focused on the cop's fear of catching AIDS from giving the kiss of life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're already telling us, what we need to think.
And the opening paragraph highlights the cop is young, influencing the reader before the story is even told.
Oh, absolutely. Before they even get into the story, they're focusing our attention on this young policeman. Not just a policeman, he's a young policeman. Somebody who's got his whole career ahead of him and now, quote, fears AIDS after giving what was an important, if not an heroic act in saving another human life. I mean, it's very clear in telling the reader what to think. And so the article continues. The policeman went to the assistance of 25-year-old Paul Soames, who collapsed while in police custody at Portsmouth. Chief Inspector David Hanna said, "We are taking all steps to monitor the condition of the officer who tried to resuscitate Mr. Soames. All officers who were in contact with Mr. Soames, an AIDS carrier, will be monitored." It took 12 policemen to control Soames after he went berserk at his mother's home in Southsea.
Again, all the concern is with the officers, with no regard that a mother has just lost her son, and while in police custody, where he should have been safe, regardless of why he was there.
Absolutely. And I know you or I are not for a moment suggesting or implying that there's been any wrongdoing by the police here, but the article and the commentary from the Chief Inspector himself is just very unsympathetic to the fact that this young man, Paul, has just lost his life while in police custody, and a mother has just lost her son, and a family have lost a loved one, and all the attention and focus is on this irrational fear of this policeman or the officers that they've somehow managed to contract HIV and AIDS through trying to perform an act of resuscitation of mouth to mouth on an individual, where it had been widely accepted years beforehand that mouth to mouth and saliva is not a route of transmission for HIV and AIDS. And it's just really kind of sickening that this is kind of the narrative that they're pushing. And I kind of get that what they're doing here is letting us know that you've got these dedicated public servants that are out there on the front line keeping us all safe. And this is what they're having to face. They're having to face the real dangers and risks and fears, to quote the article, of contracting HIV and AIDS. It's just sickening. However, the article does go on to say, Soames was taken to the police station late on Monday night. He collapsed a couple of hours later, but by the time a doctor arrived, he was dead. The cause of the outburst was still a mystery last night. Police were having difficulty finding a pathologist willing to do a post-mortem examination.
This young man, Paul, 25 years young, has lost his life while in police custody. And the press and police have totally vilified him, stigmatized Paul and his family.
This is it. And by 1987, the time of this article, foundations had already been laid by the British press in regards to vilifying and stigmatising anybody, any individual, any story that was related to HIV and AIDS. So they're on a roll, really. But I think what's quite telling about this article to me is the fact that they say that the outburst was unknown. So does this not highlight that this possibly was out of character for Paul if the outburst was unknown? You know, they weren't able to gather information and say, well, actually, this explains the outburst because, you know, he was doing or was involved in X, Y, and Z. This wasn't a pattern of behaviour, it seems, if this outburst is unknown. So this probably explains that this was possibly out of character for Paul, whereas I don't think anybody who would have been reading this in 1987 would have perhaps had that question as I have. They would have just read the article, they'd have got the impression that the policeman's in danger, he's fearing he's got HIV and AIDS because he was doing an heroic act of trying to give someone the kiss of life through mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, and is a policeman, you know, whereas the individual that's got this HIV AIDS, he's found himself in police custody, so he's obviously a wrong-un. And then you had in the 80s the stigma around how people contracted HIV. Was it through immoral acts in regards to their sexuality, which makes no mention of that in the article here, which quite surprised me actually, given, you know, Paul was a young man. Or is it through, which was the other one in the 80s, was through drug use? You know, anybody who does drugs who contracts HIV, then obviously they deserve it because they shouldn't be doing drugs. So I think the way that the article's all been set up in that regard, kind of narrative and the stigma that already existed that people were already aware of, just feeds into giving Paul absolutely zero sympathy. And the same story appeared in a second article on the same day, the 7th of January 1987, this time in the Guardian newspaper, where the headline wasn't so grotesque. It had been toned down slightly, and the headline was, Virus Test for Police. Blood samples were taken last night from 4 Hampshire police officers following the death in custody of a 25-year-old AIDS sufferer 2 hours after he was arrested at his South Sea home. A police spokesman said that the officer's clothing was being disinfected. Sorry, I can't do it.
Do you want me to continue reading it? All 4 had been given a reassuring talk by the police surgeon. Mr. Paul Soames was arrested after attacking his invalid mother, Mrs. Ivy Soames, and smashing up her home. Mr. Soames collapsed about an hour after being put into a cell at Portsmouth Central Police Station. He had cuts and bruises when he was taken in. One officer reportedly tried to resuscitate him before his medical condition was known. A Home Office pathologist, Dr. Roger Ainsworth, agreed to carry out a post-mortem examination of Mr. Soames, whose body was lying in isolation at St. Mary's Hospital, Portsmouth. The hospital general manager, Mr. Richard Bishop, expressed concern on behalf of the hospital staff about taking part in the examination.
Oh, thanks for stepping in there. You know, it just was getting me a little bit choked that, you know, here you've got a 25-year-old young man just lost his life, regardless of why he was in police custody. And let's face it, the articles don't highlight that it was the crime of the century. And, you know, he's lost his life, and I can't believe that the priority of the journalists, the newspapers, and the police spokesman is that the police have gone off to have HIV and AIDS tests, and that the police, that 4 police officers, are disinfectant in their clothes. It's just, it just blew my mind, and I don't even know why I'm surprised, really, because it's just, I think it was just surprising that even the police were just not even letting the people of Hampshire know, you know, where the incident took place, but they're letting the nation know, because these were 2 national newspapers. They were letting the nation know that even the police were concerned about coming into contact with people with HIV and AIDS in 1987. So much so that, fucking hell, you could catch AIDS if you got it on your clothes. And I know in the article it says there were minor cuts and bruises, so maybe there was the fear there of transmission through maybe a couple of cuts that Paul had. But still, I just don't understand why this would be information that would need to be told via a spokesperson for the police to a journalist. I've been in the hotel sector, come across and dealt with dead bodies and bodily fluids and so forth. And, the housekeeping team. And you do these things discreetly. You clean and sanitize things discreetly. You don't fucking broadcast it to everybody. But I don't know, I just found it just really sickening, actually. I mean, I'm assuming that the police officer didn't get AIDS because there was nothing else that followed afterwards, article-wise. What I did take away, actually, from this second article is that the article stated that the police weren't aware of Paul's HIV/AIDS status until after they attempted resuscitation. So I'm assuming because it was after they attempted resuscitation, obviously Paul had obviously expired by this point, is that somebody else must have told him that Paul had HIV/AIDS. And it'd be quite interesting to know who communicated that information, because I don't know what the procedure is when someone goes into police custody, especially back in 1987. I mean, did they make attempts to find out your medical history and background, to find out, if there's any kind of underlying health conditions to be concerned about that, you might need care for, or any medications that they need to supply you with while you're within custody? So is that possibly how they found out it was HIV positive? And it was a while after, because obviously, I don't think things like this would have been instant back then. Or was it a case of, they'd gone back to speak to Paul's family, perhaps witnesses, to find out, what had happened, and maybe that's when it was disclosed that he was either HIV positive or was with an AIDS diagnosis. And I say either because we don't know. Somebody who's got an AIDS diagnosis, generally the CD4 count is below 200. I can't see them being able to have the strength to put up a fight with 12 police officers. So kind of, to me, just my basic knowledge of HIV and AIDS is the fact that would rule out that he didn't have an AIDS diagnosis. He might have been HIV positive in the early stages of it or halfway through, but definitely doesn't sound like he was an AIDS sufferer, as they termed it.
That's an interesting point. All the article needed to focus on was that a 25-year-old man had died in police custody after being arrested for a domestic in his family home.
Exactly, like we mentioned earlier, if this was a story that was in the public interest, then like you say, all it needed to explain was that a young man had died in custody and that the police had found him, tried to resuscitate him, but were unsuccessful, pending post-mortem until such time, cause of death unknown. And if they needed to explain, again, public interest, and share his HIV diagnosis, then they could have, just stated the man was known to be living with HIV/AIDS, and the officer concerned had taken precaution by taking tests. Like you said, that's all that needed to be said. You didn't need all this fucking rhetoric and drama around the story, because essentially, if you take away the AIDS diagnosis, you had somebody who had been arrested, taken into police custody, which to that point is very normal. But just sadly, Paul lost his life. And I think that should have been the lead of the story, is the fact that a young man, 25 years old, had lost his life in police custody.
An incredibly sad story.
An incredibly sad story, especially for Paul's mother and the whole of Paul's family.
Were you able to find out any more about Paul and how he died in police custody?
Well, I think given the nature of Paul's death, there's possibly a lot of information that could be gathered, but so much time has passed now. This happened in 1987, so I'm kind of very doubtful that any information would still survive today. So that means we had to rely on publicly available information. So this might come as a surprise to some people, but our birth, marriage and death certificates here in the UK are classified as public information. So I requested Paul's death certificate, and I have that here in front of me. So as the articles stated, Paul died on the 6th of January 1987. They published their articles on the 7th of January, so the very next day. Very little time between Paul passing away and those two newspapers telling the nation that Paul was, to quote them, an AIDS sufferer. He died in police cell number 4 at Central Police Station in Portsmouth. His full name is given as Paul Andrew Soames, born in 1962 in Salisbury. His usual address at Southsea, Hampshire. And the name of the informant is actually the coroner. It states that the certificate received from the name of the coroner for Portsmouth. Generally, when there's going to be an inquest held, which there was in this case, when an inquest is going to be held, the coroner is generally the one that's the informant on the certificate, because they have to approve that the body can be released and to be laid to rest. And given Paul had already had a post-mortem, it seems to be the case that the coroner was willing to allow the body to be released and laid to rest. And it states that the inquest was held 4 days prior to the final certificate being issued, which was the 19th of March 1987. And the cause of death, which was only one, which was overdose of alcohol and drugs. And the verdict from the inquest was death by misadventure.
Misadventure. What a sad story. Did you find any surviving family for Paul?
Well, Gloria, after a little bit of detective work, I did manage to track down Paul's sister Claire. Now, she agreed to speak to me and she gave me a wonderful insight into the kind of person that Paul was. But she was also able to confirm that he'd never had cause to find himself in custody before and that this was very much out of character for Paul. Interestingly, Ivy Soames, whom the article described as Paul's invalid mother, was in fact Paul's elderly step-grandmother. Now, we know Paul was under the influence at the time, given he'd had cross words with Ivy, his grandmother, but Ivy never shared what actually happened at the home that day. But I can't help but get the feeling that Paul only found himself in custody, as was typical with domestics such as this in the 80s, to perhaps just spend the night in the cells to sleep it off, to sober up. The family had no knowledge of Paul's HIV status, which in the run-up to Paul's death in 1987 will no doubt have been an extremely difficult diagnosis for someone like Paul in his early 20s to have to come to terms with. A sense of foreboding only exacerbated by the ignorance, fear and stigma around HIV/AIDS in a 1980s society, only fuelled by the national press. Now, naturally, the death of Paul is still very raw for his family, and no doubt compounded by the manner in which these articles were articulated by those newspapers. In a bid to give Paul a voice, a say in what was written about him, his sister Claire gave an insight into what Paul was actually like as a person. The family fondly remembers Paul as being a kind, caring and sensitive soul, with a creative flair for art and photography. With many cherished memories of Paul, one that stood out was Paul was renowned for being able to run along the pebbled beach barefoot, whilst everyone else hobbled across the stones. And there is not a day that goes by that Paul isn't fondly remembered by his family. And while we can't rewrite history, I'd like to thank Paul's sister Claire and Paul's family for giving us an insight into who Paul really was, which perhaps goes some way in rewriting the narrative of those appalling newspaper articles.
Well, regardless of why Paul was in police custody, he didn't deserve to lose his life, and certainly not vilified for his HIV status, and so publicly. Those papers should be ashamed.
Absolutely.
What a sad story. What's the next story?
This final article moves away from the police and this time to the prison system, where the Daily Telegraph published this story the following year on the 21st of June 1988. And the headline for this story reads, are you ready? You can hold on to your knickers. Jail governor washes AIDS prisoners' underpants.
No way. Is this a serious one?
Well, bear with me, because this is a great story for its time in tackling HIV stigma. Because remember, this is 1988. So the article reads as follows. The governor of a top security jail washed the underpants of a prisoner carrying the AIDS virus with his own hands to defuse a revolt by men working in the prison laundry. It was disclosed yesterday. Prisoners at Long Larting had ostracised the inmate who was living in the hospital block, and 23 men in the laundry went on strike for fear of contamination. The man was HIV positive but did not have full-blown AIDS. So, Mr. Whitty did the washing to show laundry workers they could not catch the virus in that way. The move worked, and the ban on washing the inmates' laundry was ended.
And what a great way to address the stigma and discrimination.
I mean, absolutely, hats off, or should we say pants off, to Jail Governor Whitty for breaking down stigma in this way. Absolutely brilliant.
I guess we will never know if the 23 men had genuine concern or if they were just being assholes.
I'm kind of with you, actually. Did these 23 men have genuine concern? The risk of transmission of AIDS or HIV from a pair of underpants, or were they just being arseholes? Especially when we know what men get up to in prison. They're all bumming each other. So to be worried about a little bit of HIV or AIDS on a pair of underpants does seem to be a little bit far-fetched.
But are you telling me in 1988, these prisons didn't have a washing machine?
And yeah, I was quite surprised, actually, that they would be hand-washing their inmates' smalls in prison. I mean, it's a great way of punishment, but how many men do you know in prison that are like proper knicker sniffers? So I wonder if you always got your knickers back. when you sent them down to the prison laundry, missing a couple of pairs because you've got the serial knicker sniffer that's been locked up 24 hours a day. But what a fantastic way of tackling HIV stigma in the prison system. However, sadly, the article doesn't end there, because it also goes on to give other examples of HIV and AIDS stigma that other prisoners were facing in other prisons. So the article continues. Miss Una Padell, Deputy Director, said an inmate at Low Newton Remand Centre, County Durham, said he was being segregated, forced to eat off plastic plates, was refused haircuts and allowed to shave only once a week. Prisoners at Brixton had been instructed to eat off numbered plastic plates, even though the prison department had said the virus could not be transmitted in that way. The Home Office said that prisons containing inmates with the virus, there are 58 recorded cases, were advised to put them in ordinary accommodation and allow them as normal regime as possible.
Exactly. Why did they still have to be told in 1988 that there was no danger or risk?
Oh, absolutely. And the routes of transmission for AIDS and HIV were understood almost at the start. I mean, I certainly saw in the British press articles in 1982 that medical professionals and governments advise unknown routes of transmission for AIDS and then HIV. Routes which are pretty much the same as they are today as they were back then. I think it's undeniable that the archives show British and global press are entirely responsible for HIV stigma then, and of which still exists today in one form or another. And I suspect their lack of support for the petition on HIV stigma would have meant that they would have had to face up to the fact that the petition only existed from what they had started and fueled over the last few decades.
All of the actual newspaper articles mentioned in this serving are available on the Extra Tea blog. You can find the link below in the show notes. If you've enjoyed listening to Two Bitter Old Queens, then don't be a shady bitch and show us some love with
a big fat like,
a comment,
a share, as in the link, not as in, do you believe in life after love? Oh.
And for fuck's sake, don't forget to
subscribe and follow.